A black teacher, fresh from receiving a national award for excellence, steps into a high-end boutique to celebrate her achievement. But in a matter of moments, her joy turns to humiliation when a store clerk accuses her of theft without any cause. What happens next will leave you speechless and spark a movement that changes everything. Stay with me. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and challenge. It all began as just an ordinary day. The air in the cafe was thick with the scent of freshly ground coffee and the quiet murmur of morning conversations. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, casting long shadows over polished tables. At first glance, it was an ordinary day in an ordinary place. But for Ruth Ellis, this morning carried an edge she couldn't quite name. It was the kind of unease she had learned to live with. A rhythm that played in the background of her life like a bass line no one else seemed to hear. Ruth, in her mid-60s, carried herself with the kind of grace that comes from years of being scrutinized. Her gray curls framed a face lined with stories and wisdom, though her warm brown eyes still held the sharpness of someone who had seen too much to look away. She sat alone near the window, her book unopened beside a steaming cup of tea, trying to enjoy a moment of stillness. But the stillness didn't last long. A man at the counter, tall and broad, turned to scan the room as he waited for his coffee. His gaze landed on Ruth and lingered just a beat too long. Not in recognition, but in something closer to suspicion. Ruth felt it immediately, the way one feels a change in the wind before a storm. She glanced down at her hands, steadying herself as the familiar weight of being out of place settled over her. The barista called the man's name, snapping his attention away. He grabbed his drink and left without a word. But the moment lingered. Ruth sipped her tea, willing herself not to let the unease settle too deeply. Yet, as she looked around the cafe, she caught snippets of a different kind of silence. The kind that follows a glance. A whispered assumption. An invisible wall reinforced by centuries of fear and misunderstanding. Ruth shifted in her seat and opened her book, hoping to lose herself in its pages. But before she could, a young server approached, her apron crisp but her smile hesitant. "Ma'am," the girl began, her voice soft but firm. "We're really busy today, and we were wondering if you'd mind moving to one of the tables near the back." Ruth looked up, her calm gaze meeting the girl's anxious one. She glanced around. Half the tables in the cafe were empty, including the one beside her. "I don't think that will be necessary," Ruth said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of practiced patience. The server's cheeks flushed. "I understand, but we have some regulars who like to sit here, and they'll be coming in soon." Ruth smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I see. Well, I'm a paying customer, too, and I'd prefer to stay here." The girl hesitated, glancing toward the manager at the counter. A man who was watching the exchange with folded arms and a face that betrayed no sympathy. Ruth had seen that look before. The quiet complicity of someone who wouldn't say the words but wouldn't stop them either. The young woman mumbled an apology and scurried away. Ruth turned back to her book. But the moment was already ruined. She felt the hum beneath the surface. That subtle but persistent vibration that reminded her she was never truly at ease in spaces where she wasn't expected. Where her presence could so easily be questioned. As the minutes passed, she caught the glances, the sidelong looks from other patrons, the tightening of smiles that didn't quite meet her own. Each look felt like a ripple in a pond, small but unrelenting, spreading outward until the entire room felt charged with an unspoken tension. Ruth took a slow, steady breath. She had been here before, in this quiet battle with a world that demanded she justify her existence. The rules were always unspoken, the boundaries invisible but deeply felt. And though she was used to the fight, it never failed to wear on her soul. Still, Ruth was not one to retreat. Not now, not ever. She set down her book, raised her cup of tea to her lips, and stared out the window. The sunlight had shifted, casting sharper shadows on the street outside. It was a small reminder. Perhaps, that light could pierce even the thickest darkness. In her mind, she replayed her grandmother's voice. A whisper from decades past. "Don't let them make you small." You belong. Just as much as anyone else. Ruth's grip on her cup tightened. She wasn't moving to the back of the cafe. Not today. Ruth left the cafe not long after the exchange. The weight of the morning pressing heavily against her chest. She walked down the bustling street. Her heels clicking softly on the pavement. The city alive with its usual rhythm. Horns blaring. Snippets of conversation floating through the air. And the faint hum of distant construction. Yet, for all its noise, Ruth couldn't shake the silence that had followed her in the cafe. The kind that settled not in the ears but in the soul. She turned a corner and headed toward the market. A familiar place that had always offered her some measure of solace. The vibrant stalls brimming with fresh produce and fragrant spices provided a brief reprieve from the world's harsher edges. Ruth loved the market, not just for its offerings but for the sense of community it usually held. Here, she could lose herself in the rhythm of people bargaining, laughing, and exchanging stories. But even here, the hum followed her. At the flower stand, Ruth admired the freshly cut blooms. A vibrant bouquet of dahlias caught her eye. Their deep reds and oranges a perfect match for the warm hues of the approaching autumn. She reached out to pick them up. But before she could, the vendor, a wiry man with graying hair, stepped forward, his hand intercepting hers. Those are reserved, he said abruptly, his tone flat. Ruth pulled her hand back. Startled, she glanced at the flowers and then at the vendor, who was now avoiding her gaze. I didn't see a sign, she said evenly. They're for a regular customer. He replied curtly, as if that settled the matter. Ruth stood for a moment. The dahlias still vivid in her peripheral vision. She had shopped at this stand many times before. Greeted with politeness, even warmth. But today, the shift was unmistakable. The vendor's stiff posture, his averted eyes. It all spoke to an unspoken boundary she'd unknowingly crossed. Ah, there they are, a voice interrupted. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a tailored coat and carrying a designer handbag, stepped forward. She reached for the dahlias with an easy familiarity, her smile directed at the vendor. The man's demeanor transformed instantly. His face softened, and his voice took on a warmth Ruth hadn't heard just moments before. Good morning, Mrs. Lowell. Your usual bouquet, of course. Ruth stepped back, her presence shrinking in the shadow of their exchange. She watched as Mrs. Lowell handed over her payment, chatting lightly with the vendor as though Ruth wasn't standing just feet away. Enjoy your day, the vendor called out cheerfully as Mrs. Lowell walked off. Dahlias in hand, Ruth lingered for a moment, her fingers brushing the fabric of her coat pocket. She could feel the fire rising in her chest. But she swallowed it down. The practiced restraint of a lifetime. Without another word, she turned and walked away from the stall. The bright flowers fading behind her. The grocery store was her next stop. A place Ruth visited weekly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she moved through the aisles, methodically placing items in her cart. Here, too, the hum found her. It wasn't the outright hostility of years past but the subtle reminders. The barely veiled glances. The way people adjusted their paths slightly to avoid brushing past her. At the checkout counter, Ruth placed her items on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young woman with dyed blue hair and a distracted expression, greeted her with a quick nod. Ruth returned the gesture and waited patiently as the woman scanned her items. Behind her, a man cleared his throat loudly. Ruth turned to see him standing with his arms crossed. His face etched with impatience. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, muttering something under his breath. Ruth offered him a polite smile, one that she hoped would diffuse whatever tension he seemed to carry. But he didn't return it. Instead, he sighed audibly, his eyes flicking to the cashier. Is there someone who can move this along? He asked. His voice just loud enough to carry. The cashier froze, her hand hovering over the scanner. Ruth felt her stomach tighten, the moment stretching uncomfortably long. I'm almost done, Ruth said softly, her voice calm but firm. The man scoffed, shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered, loud enough for Ruth to hear. The cashier glanced nervously between them, her cheeks flushing. She resumed scanning Ruth's items, her movements quick and jerky. Ruth held her ground, refusing to let her hands tremble as she placed her credit card on the counter. When the transaction was complete, she gathered her bags and turned to leave. But before she did, she caught the man's eye, holding his gaze for a moment longer than he seemed comfortable with. "Have a good day," she said evenly, her tone carrying just enough weight to remind him that she wasn't afraid. Outside, the autumn air felt heavier than before. Ruth set her bags in the trunk of her car and leaned against it for a moment, letting the chill steady her frayed nerves. She had thought that age might grant her some reprieve from moments like these. That time might erode the sharp edges of prejudice. But instead, it seemed the world had found quieter ways to remind her of its boundaries. Ways that didn't need words but spoke volumes nonetheless. She took a deep breath, her grandmother's voice returning to her once again. "You belong. Just as much as anyone else." As Ruth started the car, she resolved to keep moving forward. Today's challenges had been small, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. But Ruth was always paying attention. She knew these moments were like seeds, planted in the cracks of everyday life, growing into something larger, something harder to root out. And she knew she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Ruth drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, her grip on the steering wheel tight. The radio played softly in the background, but the cheerful chatter of the hosts felt at odds with her mood. She turned it off, letting the silence settle in the car. The day had begun to weigh on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the incidents at the cafe, the market, or the grocery store. It was the accumulation, the steady drip of indignities that made her question whether the world would ever change. She turned onto her street, lined with tidy houses and well-manicured lawns. It was a neighborhood she had lived in for nearly 3 decades. One she had chosen because it promised peace and stability. But even here, the hum of unease sometimes found her. As Ruth pulled into her driveway, she noticed her neighbor, Mr. Peterson, standing near the edge of his lawn. He was trimming his hedges, his movements deliberate and slow. His presence was a fixture on the block. He had lived there even longer than Ruth had. She nodded politely as she stepped out of the car, her arms full of groceries. "Afternoon, Ruth," Peterson called out, his tone neutral but distant. "Afternoon," she replied, her voice steady. She caught the brief flick of his eyes toward her bags before he returned to his task. As Ruth approached her front door, she heard his voice again, softer this time but carrying across the short distance between their yards. "You ever think about trimming that tree out front?" he asked, gesturing with his clippers toward the large oak that shaded her lawn. "The branches are starting to hang over the sidewalk." Ruth paused, shifting the weight of her bags. "It's on my list," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll get to it soon." Peterson nodded, but there was something in his expression. A faint tightening of his jaw, a subtle narrowing of his eyes, that hinted at a deeper disapproval. Ruth turned back toward her door, the exchange settling uneasily in her chest. She couldn't quite place why, but it felt like more than just a comment about the tree. Inside, the quiet of her home wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Ruth set the groceries on the counter and began unpacking them methodically, the rhythm of the task soothing her frayed nerves. But her thoughts kept circling back to Peterson's comment, replaying the way his voice had dipped, the way his gaze lingered just a beat too long. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a leftover defense mechanism from years of navigating a world that often seemed intent on reminding her of her difference. But then she remembered the neighborhood association meeting from a few months ago. She hadn't attended, she rarely did, but she had heard about the discussions from her friend Clara, who lived a few blocks over. They were talking about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. Clara had said, her voice laced with irony. "You know what that means, don't you?" Ruth nodded. She knew. Later that evening, Ruth decided to take a walk. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and she hoped it might help clear her mind. She pulled on a light jacket and stepped outside, the sound of leaves crunching beneath her shoes. As she made her way down the street, she passed houses glowing warmly with porch lights and the occasional laughter drifting out of open windows. But the peace she sought felt elusive. Near the corner of the block, a group of children played tag under the glow of a street lamp. Their laughter was infectious, And Ruth couldn't help but smile as she walked by. One of the children, a girl with curly hair tied in pigtails, waved at her. "Hi, Mrs. Ellis," the girl called out, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hello, sweetheart," Ruth replied, her smile widening. But as she continued walking, she noticed the girl's mother standing nearby, her arms crossed and her posture tense. The woman's eyes followed Ruth, her expression guarded. When Ruth turned the corner, she could still feel the weight of that gaze. The next day, Ruth received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address. She opened it cautiously, her heart sinking as she read the typed note inside. "Your tree is becoming an eyesore. Please address it before it brings down property values." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. Ruth stared at the words, the vague threat beneath them loud and clear. It wasn't just about the tree. It was about her, her presence in this space, her refusal to conform to an unspoken standard. Ruth placed the letter on the table, her hands trembling slightly. She thought about Peterson, about the sideways glances and the way the neighborhood's friendliness had always felt conditional. She thought about the way the children had laughed freely while their parents watched her with wary eyes. It wasn't the first time she had received a letter like this. Years ago, when she and her late husband first moved into the neighborhood, there had been similar notes, similar reminders that their welcome was fragile. But it had been years since the last one. Ruth had hoped those days were behind her. She sat down, staring at the letter as anger and sadness warred within her. The hum had grown louder, its subtlety stripped away, leaving only the sharp edges of prejudice. That evening, Ruth called Clara, needing the comfort of a familiar voice. "Clara," she began, her tone steady despite the storm in her chest. "Do you ever feel like some battles never really end?" Clara was silent for a moment before responding. "Ruth, the battles don't end, they just change. They get quieter, sneakier, but they're still there." Ruth nodded, even though Clara couldn't see her. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. Staying here, trying to hold my ground." Clara's voice softened. "It's always worth it. If we don't hold our ground, who will?" Ruth let the words settle over her, their weight both a comfort and a challenge. She looked out her window, the silhouette of her oak tree standing tall against the evening sky. Its branches stretched wide, unapologetic in their reach. Ruth decided she wouldn't trim the tree. Not yet. Ruth Ellis stood at the bus stop, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck as a brisk autumn wind swept through the air. She didn't mind waiting, in fact. She welcomed the moments of stillness the bus stop provided. It was a chance to observe the rhythm of her neighborhood, the comings and goings, the faces that hurried past her, most offering polite but empty smiles. The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing as it slowed to a stop. Ruth stepped aboard, swiping her card and nodding at the driver, a young man with weary eyes. She made her way to a seat near the middle, careful to tuck her bag against her side to avoid taking up too much space. As the bus began to move, Ruth noticed a man sitting across the aisle, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment too long. He wore a crisp suit, and his briefcase rested neatly at his feet. Ruth didn't acknowledge him, instead turning her attention to the view outside the window. But she could feel his stare, heavy and intrusive, even as he feigned interest in the newspaper spread open on his lap. The bus filled quickly at the next stop, passengers jostling for space as they boarded. A white woman in her 40s stepped on, her coat pristine and her expression carefully neutral. She scanned the bus for an empty seat, her eyes landing briefly on Ruth's row. Ruth offered a small, welcoming smile, but the woman's gaze flicked away as if she hadn't seen it. She chose to stand instead, gripping the overhead bar. Ruth turned back to the window, her smile fading. The bus rolled on, and the hum of voices and the occasional cough filled the air. But Ruth's thoughts were elsewhere. The woman's choice was a small thing, so small it could almost be dismissed. But it wasn't just one choice. It was part of a pattern Ruth had seen time and again. Subtle rejections, unspoken judgments, the quiet ways people declared who did and didn't belong. Later that day, Ruth arrived at the community center for a meeting of the neighborhood association. She had debated attending. These gatherings often left her drained. a stark reminder of the unspoken hierarchies that governed her world. But Clara had insisted. "You need to be there, Ruth," Clara had said over the phone. "If you're not, they'll just assume you don't care." The meeting was held in a modest room with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Ruth took a seat near the back, her presence unassuming but deliberate. Around her, the room buzzed with conversation. Neighbors exchanging pleasantries, discussing local issues, and occasionally throwing glances her way. The meeting began with a discussion about property upkeep, a favorite topic among the group. A man named Mr. Randall, who prided himself on his no-nonsense approach, stood to address the crowd. "We need to ensure our neighborhood maintains its standards," Randall said, his voice booming. "That means holding everyone accountable. Overgrown lawns, unkempt trees, these things bring down the value of all our homes." Ruth felt the weight of the room's attention shift toward her. Even though no one looked directly at her, it was a tactic she had grown familiar with. Criticisms aimed at no one in particular but intended for someone specific. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. As the discussion continued, another neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, chimed in. "And we should address the issue of parking," she said, her tone light but pointed. "Some people's visitors are taking up spaces that should be for residents." Ruth knew exactly who she meant. Her son, David, often visited on weekends, parking his car on the street outside her house. It wasn't against any rules, but she had heard the whispers. Comments about how his car stood out in their otherwise pristine neighborhood. The conversation meandered, touching on topics from noise complaints to holiday decorations. But the underlying current remained the same. It was a subtle yet persistent effort to draw lines between who belonged and who didn't, cloaked in the language of rules and regulations. As the meeting adjourned, Ruth lingered, not wanting to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rush out. She made her way to the refreshment table, where Clara was pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Ruth," Clara said, her voice low, "you did well to keep your cool. I wanted to throw my coffee at Randall when he started going on about standards." Ruth gave a small, weary smile. "It's the same song and dance, Clara. They don't even try to hide it anymore." Clara nodded, her expression somber. "But they don't expect you to push back. That's why it matters that you show up." Ruth glanced around the room, taking in the faces of her neighbors. Some polite, others indifferent, and a few openly hostile. She thought about the letter she had received, the cold stares on the bus, the woman who chose to stand rather than sit beside her. It wasn't just the overt acts of discrimination that weighed on her. It was the cumulative effect of these daily affronts. The quiet erosion of her dignity. "I'll keep showing up," Ruth said finally, her voice steady. "But it doesn't mean it gets any easier." That evening, Ruth sat in her living room, a cup of tea in her hands and a heavy blanket draped over her lap. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment sharpening her awareness of the unspoken rules that governed her world. She thought about the oak tree in her yard, its branches stretching defiantly toward the sky. It had weathered storms, grown through seasons of change, and stood tall despite the odds. Ruth felt a kinship with that tree, a quiet resilience that refused to be uprooted. The hum of polite society, with its carefully coded words and quiet exclusions, was insidious, but Ruth knew that confronting it required more than endurance, it required courage. The kind of courage that didn't always come with fanfare or applause. It was the courage to sit, to stand, to show up, even when the world made it clear you were unwelcome. And so, as the tea cooled in her hands, Ruth resolved to keep pushing, to keep holding her ground, no matter how quiet or insidious the opposition might be. Ruth Ellis sat at her kitchen table, the morning light spilling in through the window, casting soft shadows across the room. The warmth of her coffee cup felt grounding in her hands as she scanned the letter she had just received. It was from the Neighborhood Association, another formal reminder about community standards and the importance of compliance with neighborhood guidelines. The words were polite, yet sharp. "As a valued member of our community, we trust you will take the necessary steps to ensure your property reflects the standards we all uphold." Ruth could practically hear Mr. Randall's self-satisfied tone beneath the printed words. Her house, with its slightly faded shutters and the sprawling oak tree out front, had become a quiet symbol of defiance, a refusal to conform to the immaculate sameness that her neighbors seemed to demand. Ruth set the letter down and took a deep breath. She had lived in this house for over 30 years, long before most of the people who now felt entitled to critique her every choice. Yet, the sense of ownership she felt was always tempered by the reminders. Letters like this, sidelong glances, and hushed conversations, that in their eyes, she didn't truly belong. That afternoon, Ruth decided to walk to the small park at the edge of the neighborhood. Her favorite spot to clear her mind. She passed rows of neatly trimmed hedges and manicured lawns, each house a mirror of the next, their uniformity a stark contrast to her own weathered but loved home. As she walked, she noticed Mrs. Whitaker gardening in her front yard. Their eyes met briefly, and Mrs. Whitaker gave a tight smile before bending back to her work. Ruth kept walking, her steps steady but her thoughts swirling. At the park, she found her usual bench beneath the large maple tree. Its leaves had begun to turn, vibrant reds and oranges that fluttered gently in the autumn breeze. Ruth settled onto the bench and pulled a book from her bag, hoping to lose herself in its pages. But she hadn't been reading long when she heard voices. A group of teenagers had gathered near the basketball court, their laughter ringing out across the park. Ruth watched as they passed the ball back and forth, their energy infectious. Among them was a young black boy, his joy evident as he dribbled and shot, his friends cheering him on. It was a beautiful scene. But Ruth's contentment was interrupted when an older man in a tracksuit approached the group. His expression was stern, his gestures sharp as he spoke. Though Ruth couldn't hear the words, she recognized the tone, a mix of authority and unspoken accusation. The teenagers' laughter faded, replaced by silence and awkward shuffling. The man pointed at the boy, his voice rising enough for Ruth to catch fragments. Not a playground for trouble. People are watching, respectful. Ruth's chest tightened as she watched the boy nod, his shoulders sagging as he stepped off the court. The man walked away, satisfied, leaving the group in uneasy silence. Later that week, Ruth attended a town hall meeting held at the community center. The topic was supposed to be about upcoming projects, but the conversation quickly turned to complaints about the park. "I've noticed an increase in noise and, frankly, rowdy behavior," said a woman seated near the front. "We need stricter rules to ensure the park remains a safe and welcoming place." Others nodded in agreement. Mr. Randall, ever the loudest voice, added, "It's about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. We all know what happens when standards slip." Ruth felt the familiar burn of anger rising in her chest. She knew exactly what they meant by character and standards. It was a way to disguise prejudice as practicality, to mask exclusion behind concern. When the floor was opened for comments, Ruth stood, her movements deliberate, all eyes turned toward her. The room growing quieter, she felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken challenge in their silence. "I've lived in this neighborhood for decades," Ruth began, her voice steady, "and I've watched it change over the years. But one thing that hasn't changed is the way some people are treated as outsiders. No matter how long they've been here or how much they contribute." Murmurs rippled through the room, some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "When we talk about standards and character, we need to be honest about what we're really saying," Ruth continued, "because what I see are kids playing in the park, enjoying the same space that's meant for all of us. And I see people trying to make this community better, not worse." She paused, letting her words settle. "We can't call ourselves a community if we're not willing to include everyone who lives here. It's not about lowering standards, it's about raising our understanding of what it means to belong." Ruth sat down, her heart pounding as the room remained silent. Clara, seated next to her, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "That needed to be said," Clara whispered. As the meeting ended, Ruth noticed Mr. Randall lingering near the exit. He caught her eye and gave her a tight nod, a gesture that felt more like acknowledgement than agreement. It wasn't much, but Ruth took it as a small victory. Walking home that night, Ruth felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were mounting, each one heavier than the last. But she also knew that resistance didn't have to be loud to be effective. It could be found in the quiet moments. The act of standing up, of speaking truth, of holding one's ground. In a world that often sought to erase her presence, Ruth resolved to keep leaving her mark. One step at a time. Ruth stood in the aisle of the community grocery store, a small basket hanging on her arm as she scanned the shelves for her usual brand of coffee. The store was one of the few places in the neighborhood where she felt she could take her time. The slow hum of life moving past her without much notice. But today, the air felt heavier, the kind of weight that settled in spaces where words were left unspoken. As she reached for the familiar blue and gold package, a voice cut through the relative quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am," the cashier called, her tone sharp, though forced into politeness. "Do you have the right aisle?" Ruth turned slowly, confused. The young woman behind the counter had a fixed smile, but her eyes betrayed a coldness that stung. Ruth glanced at the coffee in her hand, then back at the cashier. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with firmness. "Oh, no problem," the cashier said, her tone light now, as though Ruth were the one misunderstanding the situation. "It's just, this is the premium section. Sometimes people don't realize." Ruth blinked, the implication settling over her like a shadow. She placed the coffee in her basket without another word, her heart pounding as she made her way to the checkout. The cashier's eyes followed her the entire time, her smile never faltering, her silence loud enough to drown out the soft hum of the store. Later that week, Ruth found herself at the neighborhood book club. It was a monthly ritual she joined years ago, hoping to connect with her neighbors. Over time, it had become a space for quiet observation, a room where the books discussed were often less revealing than the conversations around them. That month's selection was a historical novel set during the Great Migration. A story of a black family seeking a better life in the North, only to find themselves facing new forms of exclusion. As the discussion began, Ruth listened as the group danced around the book's central themes. "It's a beautiful story," Mrs. Whitaker said, her tone reverent, "but so tragic. It's hard to imagine people being treated that way." "It really is," another voice chimed in. "Thankfully, we've come a long way since then." Ruth felt a tightness in her chest. She looked around the circle, noting the satisfied nods, the relieved agreement that the world had changed, that such things were relics of a bygone era. Finally, she spoke. "Do you really think that kind of treatment is in the past?" Her voice was steady, but the room fell silent as if she'd dropped a stone into still water. Mrs. Whitaker blinked, clearly startled. "Well, of course, there's still some work to be done," she said, her tone cautious. "But things are much better now. Don't you think?" Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "Better doesn't mean fixed. Just last week, I was reminded, subtly, of course, that some people think I don't belong in my own neighborhood. That kind of treatment isn't history. It's just quieter now." The group exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, others avoiding her eyes altogether. "I think what Ruth is saying," Clara interjected, her voice a lifeline in the tension, "is that we can't be complacent. We have to see the ways these issues persist, even if they aren't as obvious as they once were." Ruth nodded her thanks to Clara. But the conversation shifted quickly after that, veering back to the book in a way that felt deliberate. Ruth stayed quiet for the rest of the meeting, her thoughts heavy as she watched the group move on. The following morning, Ruth sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the familiar creak of the old wooden boards beneath her chair grounding her. She thought about the book club, the grocery store, the countless small moments that built upon each other until they formed a mountain too steep to ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find a young boy standing on her porch, holding a clipboard. He couldn't have been more than 12, his wide eyes and tentative smile reminding her of her own grandson. "Good morning," he said nervously. "I'm selling raffle tickets for our school fundraiser. Would you like to buy one?" Ruth smiled, her heart softening. "Of course," she said, reaching for her wallet. "How much?" $5 each, he said, holding out the clipboard. As Ruth handed over a crisp bill, a voice called from the sidewalk. "Jimmy, come on, don't bother her." A man, likely the boy's father, stood a few feet away. His expression was neutral, But his tone carried the same underlying tension Ruth had felt at the store. Jimmy hesitated, looking at Ruth with a mix of embarrassment and apology before running back to his father. "Thank you," Ruth named after him, her voice warm. The boy waved as he walked away. But the man didn't look back. Ruth stood on the porch for a moment, the encounter settling into her mind like a stone dropped into deep water. It wasn't the boy's fault. She knew. He had only offered her an invitation. But the man's reaction spoke volumes. A quiet rejection. A subtle reminder of the barriers that still stood. That evening, Ruth wrote in her journal, her thoughts flowing freely onto the page. It's not the loud moments that cut the deepest. It's the silences, the pauses, the sidelong glances, the words left unsaid. They build over time, each one adding to the weight we carry. And yet, we endure. We endure because we must. Because to stop is to concede. And that is not an option. The sound of silence may echo loudest, but it cannot drown us out forever. Ruth set down her pen, her resolve solidifying. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't let the silences go unchallenged. Quiet resistance was still resistance, and she was determined to make her voice heard, even if it began with just a whisper. Ruth's mornings had always been sacred. The quiet ritual of brewing her tea, the deliberate folding of the newspaper, the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. These were the small anchors that held her steady in an unsteady world. But this morning, the world pressed against her in ways that even her cherished routine couldn't soothe. She stared at the headline on the front page of the local newspaper. Tensions rise at city council over housing policy changes. Ruth read on, her brow furrowing with each line. The article described heated debates over proposed zoning laws, changes that would allow for affordable housing developments in wealthier neighborhoods. Opponents claimed it would disrupt the character of the community. Ruth had heard those words before, thinly veiled euphemisms for exclusion. The article quoted one council member's comments, "We want progress, but not at the expense of our way of life." Ruth set the paper down, the weight of its implications pressing into her chest. That afternoon, Ruth attended a community meeting at the library. It was advertised as a forum for neighbors to voice their opinions on the housing proposal. Ruth arrived early, choosing a seat near the back where she could observe the room. The crowd was mostly white, a sea of familiar faces from grocery stores, parks, and sidewalks. She recognized a few from her book club. As the moderator opened the floor for discussion, the room crackled with tension. A man in a crisp button-down shirt stood, his voice loud and confident. "I'm not against affordable housing," he began, the practiced prelude of someone preparing to deliver a veiled blow. "But let's be honest, this isn't about housing, it's about changing the nature of our neighborhoods. We've worked hard to create safe, quiet communities. Why should we sacrifice that?" Applause rippled through the room. Ruth clenched her hands in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. She could feel the subtle shifts in the room's energy, the unspoken agreement that those who would benefit from the policy were outsiders. A threat. A younger woman stood next, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "I grew up in this neighborhood," she said, "and I've seen how it's changed over the years. Not because of new people coming in, but because of the barriers keeping so many out. This policy isn't about sacrifice, it's about fairness. Everyone deserves a chance to live here." The applause was thinner this time. Hesitant, Ruth caught a few disapproving murmurs, the undercurrent of resistance bubbling just below the surface. When Ruth finally rose to speak, the room quieted. She hadn't planned to say anything, but the tension in her chest demanded release. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of her years. "I've lived in this city for decades," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Long enough to know that the character of a neighborhood isn't defined by who lives there, but by how they treat one another." A few heads nodded, but most faces remained unreadable. "I remember when my family moved into our first home here," she continued. "We were one of the first black families on the block. Some neighbors welcomed us. Others, well, let's just say they made it clear we weren't wanted. But we stayed. We stayed because we believed this community could be better, kinder, more inclusive, and in many ways, it has been. But the work isn't done." Ruth paused, letting the silence settle. I hear a lot of fear in this room, she said, her voice softening. Fear of change, fear of loss. But what are we really afraid of? That we might have to share what we've built. That we might have to confront the idea that the walls we've put up to protect ourselves might also be keeping others out? The room was still. Ruth could feel the unease, the resistance to her words, but also a glimmer of recognition. She had struck a nerve. After the meeting, Ruth lingered near the library entrance, her notebook tucked under her arm. A few people approached her, offering quiet words of thanks. One woman, her face lined with the wear of years, touched Ruth's arm gently. You have more courage than I do, she said, her voice tinged with guilt. I've felt the same way for a long time. But I've never spoken up. Ruth smiled, her expression warm but firm. It takes all of us, she said. Courage isn't just about speaking up, it's about listening, too. As Ruth walked home, the weight in her chest had shifted. The meeting hadn't resolved anything. If anything, it had revealed how deeply entrenched the divisions were. But it had also shown her that the fractures in the community were not unbridgeable. Beneath the fear and resistance, there was a shared desire for something better. That evening, Ruth sat on her porch, the hum of cicadas filling the air. She thought about the day's events, about the man's loud confidence and the young woman's trembling voice. She thought about the woman who had thanked her and the countless others who had stayed silent. In her journal, she wrote, "The mirror is cracked, but it still reflects. Our community is fractured, but it is not broken. We see ourselves in its pieces. Our fears, our hopes, our contradictions. If we are brave enough to look, perhaps we can find a way to make it whole again." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ruth closed her journal and sat in the gathering twilight, her resolve as steady as the rhythm of the cicadas' song. The air in the sanctuary was heavy, a mix of incense and the muffled murmurs of the congregation. Ruth sat near the back, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood of the pew in front of her. She hadn't intended to come to this meeting. It wasn't her church, and these weren't her people. But she had been drawn here by a quiet urgency, the sense that the fractures she had seen in the community were converging, each crack deepening toward a breaking point. The congregation had gathered to discuss the housing policy that had ignited debates across the city. Officially, it was a meeting of faith and fellowship. But Ruth knew it was more than that. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of hope and resistance, of possibility and fear. At the front of the room, the pastor, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a nervous smile, called for the meeting to begin. His voice was steady, but Ruth could sense his unease. "We are here tonight," he began, "to talk about what it means to live as neighbors. To ask ourselves how we can serve not just those we know, but those we don't." The first speaker was a young man, his words earnest but trembling. He talked about his family, about growing up in a neighborhood that had changed over the years. He spoke of his parents' sacrifices to buy a home, of their fears that new developments would bring crime or chaos. "It's not about race," he said, his voice rising defensively. "It's about protecting what we've built. We've worked hard for what we have." Ruth listened, her heart heavy. She knew the weight of those words, the unspoken assumptions they carried. She could see the nods of agreement, the way the room leaned toward his fear as though it were a truth they all shared. The next speaker was a woman Ruth recognized from the community meeting at the library. Her voice was steadier now, her words sharper. "We talk about what we've built," she said, "but we don't talk about who was excluded from building it with us. We don't talk about the red lines drawn on maps, about the neighborhoods designed to keep people out. We pretend those things are in the past. But their shadows are still here." Her words landed like a stone in a still pond, the ripples spreading uneasily through the room. A few people shifted in their seats, others sat rigid, their faces unreadable. When it was Ruth's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She felt the weight of every eye in the room as she walked to the front. Her voice, when she began, was calm but unyielding. "I've been listening," she said, her gaze sweeping over the congregation. "And I hear a lot of fear. Fear of losing what you've worked for. Fear of change. Fear of the unknown. I understand that fear. I've felt it too." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I've also felt something else. I've felt what it's like to stand at the edge of a neighborhood and know I'm not welcome. I've felt the sting of doors that stay closed, of opportunities that slip away. Not because I didn't work hard enough, but because someone decided I didn't belong. The room was silent. Ruth could feel the tension, the unspoken resistance that hung in the air. But she pressed on. Fear is a powerful thing, she said. It can make us build walls to keep others out. But those walls don't just protect us. They isolate us. They keep us from seeing one another, from understanding one another. She turned toward the pastor, her voice softening. This church, she said, gesturing to the sanctuary, is supposed to be a place of refuge. A place where all are welcome. But are we living up to that promise? Are we opening our doors? Or are we finding new ways to close them? As Ruth returned to her seat, she felt the weight of the room shift. The tension was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Reflection. A question that hadn't been there before. The meeting continued, the voices rising and falling like waves against a rocky shore. By the time it ended, the congregation was quieter, the murmur of conversation subdued. Ruth lingered near the entrance, her coat draped over her arm. A few people approached her, their faces hesitant but open. You made me think, one woman said quietly, her hand resting lightly on Ruth's arm. I don't know if I agree with everything, but, you made me think. Ruth smiled, her expression gentle. That's all any of us can do, she said. Think, and then act. Later that night, Ruth sat on her porch, the cool air brushing against her skin. She thought about the meeting, about the young man's fear and the woman's sharp words. She thought about the faces in the congregation, the way they had shifted as she spoke. In her journal, she wrote, fear is the seed of division, but it is also the soil where courage can grow. If we are brave enough to face our fears, we might find something unexpected, a chance to build bridges where walls once stood. As the stars blinked into view, Ruth felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be long, the obstacles many, but she had seen the glimmer of something tonight. A crack in the wall, a flicker of light in the darkness. And that was enough. For now, it was enough.